Chapter 5 Knowing and Knowing. Hartford School for Deaf Children was scheduled to open on April 15, 1817. For Thomas, opening day would mark the real beginning of his life's work. For Alice, the first day would open a world of magic, a world of knowing and knowing, she said, knowing without end. For Dr. Cogswell and his committee, now the board of directors of the new school, the fast approaching day called for a flurry of decisions. It was their job to figure out where the classrooms and sleeping quarters should be located and what subjects should be taught. And of course the school must have a name. They voted to call it the Connecticut Asylum for the Education and Instruction of Deaf and Dumb Persons. What a terrible choice, Thomas thought. The name was too long and too hard to remember, and the words dumb and asylum made it sound like a place for stupid and insane people. Thomas didn't like the location the board chose either, a few rented rooms in a dingy old building on Prospect Street. But he couldn't take time to worry about all that. He had too much else to do. Thomas set to work scrubbing and painting the dreary classrooms. One day when the paint smell made him feel sick, he went outside. As he walked down the street, enjoying the fresh air of early spring, he thought about the children who were coming to his school. Deaf children knew very little about the world outside their own families. Many of them were leaving home for the first time. Everything and everyone would be strange and frightening to them. As Thomas strolled past the Jeremy Adams Tavern, he remembered the sounds and smells of the stagecoach that first carried him to New Haven. He remembered how excited he had been to be going away to school, to be starting a new life. Soon Thomas's own pupils would see their lives beginning to change. They would learn to read and write and talk to each other in their new language. They would stop feeling inadequate and isolated. Each one of them would leave a world of emptiness and enter a land of knowing. In the months before opening day, Thomas traveled around New England talking with families of deaf children and telling them about the school. Alice was now 14 and old enough, Thomas thought, to go with him on some of his shorter trips. One day he took her on a visit to the Fowler farm to meet Sophia and Parnell. The Fowler sisters, ages 19 and 20, were deaf and didn't speak or sign. They lived with their parents. Alice and Thomas were invited to stay for dinner before the horse and buggy ride back to Hartford. After the meal, Mr. Fowler used a few simple signs of his own to try to tell his daughters about Thomas's school. Sophia began to hop around in circles, setting her black curls bouncing. Then she looked at Thomas, smiling and touching her forehead. All of a sudden, Alice began signing to her teacher, fingers flying. She guesses at going someplace to learn. She guesses that you teach knowing and knowing. On opening day, there were 8 students, Alice, the Fowler sisters, and 5 others. Joseph, age 11, was happy the moment he walked in the door. He slid down banisters and ran upstairs. He poked his nose everywhere and played with everything he could get his hands on. 10-year-old George was homesick and couldn't stop crying. Another boy, 13, was so scared that he rolled into a ball like a hedgehog and refused to budge. The oldest student was a 51-year-old artist named Joseph Brewster. The most frightened of all was 10-year-old Julia, both deaf and blind. She didn't understand where she was or what was happening. For the first few days, Julia screamed most of the time and wouldn't let anyone near her. But little by little, she came to trust Laurent Clerc. After a while, she let him lead her by her hand from place to place. Before long, Julia was learning the alphabet, her fingertips tracing the letters that Thomas had carved on a big wooden board. Next, Julia learned to sign, by placing her hands on Thomas's and copying the movements of his fingers. Within a few weeks, she was starting to sew. She held the end of the thread between her teeth and coaxed it through the eye of the needle with the tip of her tongue. Then her fingers guided the stitches in a straight line. In the first few days of school, Thomas taught his pupils to sign 2 very important words, tears and smiles. He told them that these were more than just words. They were feelings common to everyone. Gradually, the students began to feel safe. Strange rooms and faces became familiar. They could understand what their teachers said to them, and they could speak for themselves. Tired fingers soon grew strong and skilled at signing. News of the school spread, and by the end of the first winter, there were almost 30 students. Thomas said his friend Laurent Clerc had enough work to keep 11 people busy. He taught 6 classes every day. He showed new teachers how to do their jobs. He ordered pencils and paper and chalkboards. He answered all the letters written to the school asking questions or criticizing or congratulating. When visitors came, he showed them around. He spoke with legislators all over New England, asking them for money to buy supplies and pay teachers. By the spring of 1818, Thomas had been running the school for a year. He was exhausted. His chest ached, his throat burned, and his eyes watered. "Alas, how my energy is gone," he wrote in his diary. One day when Thomas was especially tired, Sophia Fowler gently patted his shoulder. "Are you sick?" she signed. Thomas wondered how such a small thing could make him feel so much better. Along with everything else he did that first year, Thomas continued to learn more and more about communicating with the deaf. The language of sign, he realized, is not to be learned from books. It must be learned from the living, looking, acting model. Along with Laurent Clerc, Thomas was combining the French method of signing with the new signs and facial expressions that his students used. Together, teachers and pupils were creating an American Sign Language, one that fit their own special needs and reflected their own lives and thoughts. Just before the end of the year, Thomas received an important message from Washington. James Monroe, President of the United States, wanted to visit the school. In a bustle of excitement, volunteers built a speaker's platform in the street and dressed it up with flags and banners of red, white, and blue. The students, wearing matching ribbons, were to share the platform and the limelight with the president. On the appointed day, a crowd gathered. Thomas and Laurent Clerc stood ready to escort their honored guest to the speaker's chair. The students prepared to salute. Someone shouted that the president's carriage was approaching. A tall, stoop-shouldered man stepped down from the coach. On his head was a tricorn hat. It was big and black with a wide brim that folded up in 3 places, forming points that stuck up like horns. President Monroe climbed the steps of the speaker's platform and turned to address the audience. He congratulated Thomas and the students on their important work. They had much to be proud of, he told them. He promised that with the help of the United States government, each and every state would soon have a public school for deaf children. Then President Monroe stepped aside, giving Thomas the speaker's place. Thomas talked about the history of signing, and he showed the president a few words. Next, it was the students' turn to greet their guest. Holding their hands above their heads, they moved their fingers to describe the shape of his tricorn hat. They were adding the word president to American Sign Language. Summer vacation came at last. Thomas was looking forward to a good long rest. He watched from the front steps of the school as each of his pupils waved goodbye. Thomas knew he would miss them all, but more than any others, he would miss Sophia Fowler. Earlier that day, she and Parnell had climbed into their father's wagon to jog down the road back to Fowler Farm. "It's summer," Sophia signed to Thomas. "I write you. Letter. You answer?" "I will answer," Thomas signed back. "I promise. Happy summer, Sophia."